Fanfiction. Fiction written by a fan of and featuring characters from a particular TV series, movie, etc. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, and every once in a while they become an actual novel. I started reading fanfiction near the end of middle school and have written some of my own, without actually publishing them. The more invested I got into the community, the more I started to realize the things I did like, as well as some pet peeves that I had. In this video, I will be telling you my pet peeves in fanfiction and explaining why they irritate me. Just a disclaimer, these are just my own pet peeves and is not meant to be taken seriously. Most of them are circumstantial and are in no way meant to harm anybody or stop anybody from reading or writing fanfiction. If you are a writer who does any of this, it does not make you a bad writer. Starting off with my first fanfiction pet peeve, lack of summaries or tags. When I'm reading a story, I want to have a summary before I get invested into it. I'm usually reading these in my spare time, and I take my spare time pretty seriously. And having some form of a summary helps me decide on if I want to invest my entire time or if I should move on or anything like that. This also goes for tags as well. And the main reason is because there might be something in the story that I do not like, or there could be something that they don't like, and it could make them feel upset, or whatever the case may be. I often see on AO3 and Wattpad specifically that in the summaries, instead of writing a summary, they will explain how they are bad at summaries, and that's why they didn't write one. And I understand if you're not good at summaries. Making summaries can be difficult, especially when you're condensing down an entire story or even a short story. But having even a crappy summary will help me decide on if I'm going to read it, and I'm sure it also makes other people feel that way. Like, I at least want a little bit of information before I go into reading a story. Imagine going to a restaurant and they have the picture of the dish, but you never get to see the ingredients or the price. It's just inconvenient and annoying. Same kind of goes for tags, and this can go in one or two directions. There are people with lack of tags, which again kind of is the same thing with summaries. I don't know what's going to be going on in the story or if I'm going to like it because of those tags. Or you have the other extreme, which is everything is tagged. Like, it has a tag for every single little thing that happens in the story. Or if it is over tagged, it has a bunch of random tags in order to get people into the story, which is just annoying because sometimes I'll read a story because of a specific tag, but then I end up reading the story and I'm like, wait, that never happened in the story. Where is this happening? Anyway, that's just my first pet peeve. My second pet peeve is not having warnings for very sensitive topics. I'm not going to name any of the sensitive topics, but it does get annoying when you start reading a story. Maybe it has really good tags, really good summary, or it doesn't matter. And you get to a specific part in the story with no warning, and it starts talking about something very sensitive. And I understand like people wanting to add shock to their stories. And if you are an AO3 reader, I feel like this doesn't happen too often on AO3, but it does happen a lot, especially on Wattpad. I don't know about other platforms. I don't see it too often on other platforms when I am on them. But when you have a sensitive topic, please explain that it's in the story. You don't have to go in depth on why it's in the story or anything like that. Just mention, like, hey, this sensitive topic is in the story, because sometimes that really throws somebody off and you can ruin somebody's day by that. My third one is poorly written because it was written too fast. This kind of needs more of an explanation, but this is basically when a chapter or a few chapters are written, but there was no thought put into the full-on story or how certain events happen. So you'll have 3 chapters of a normal story going on, and then all of a sudden the season changed or something in the setting changed, but it wasn't mentioned in this story previously, or like random events will happen, but like there was no build up to them, And I mean like major events. I'm not talking about like something small. I understand wanting to get the story out as soon as possible, but I would prefer a story that was written and kind of analyzed chronologically in order to make everything flow better. So I guess a more proper way of saying written too fast is that it doesn't flow well. My fourth pet peeve, and probably gonna get a lot of hate for this, but I do not like cliffhangers. I understand that fan fiction is completely different from an actual novel. Novels usually have chapters and they usually don't end in cliffhangers because you get the entire book right then and there. You don't have to wait for the next chapter to come out. But with fan fiction, you typically do have to wait for a new chapter unless somebody has written it all out and then posted the entire thing to Wattpad or AO3, fanfiction.com, whatever. It annoys me when like 20 of the chapters will have cliffhangers. And let's say you're somebody who does other things or needs to put the book down to do a particular thing. It's annoying that like it's impossible to put the book down or the story down, whatever you're reading it on, in the middle of a cliffhanger. TV shows and movies can kind of get away with that because it's media and we all know that a new show or movie is going to come out. And typically the cliffhangers aren't extremely tragic. But in some of the fan fictions that I've read, the cliffhangers are like, and then she said, or and then he said, and then you don't find out for like a month. Next pet peeve is when the dialogue doesn't match the setting. This typically happens when a story is written in a medieval setting or a old setting, but they use modern slang. It's like imagining a character from Game of Thrones saying, "Yo, what's up, dog?" and then going on with the rest of the story, as if they talk like modern people when they don't. I would prefer if you at least attempted to make the dialogue fit the era that it's written in. Unless, of course, you modernize the story, these characters shouldn't be talking in that way. Try to get as close to the dialogue of the time or the story or whatever to make it, one, feel a little bit better and to make it feel like we're actually talking to those characters or we're actually listening to those characters, whatever. The next pet peeve is repetition. So I kind of have two categories with repetition. The first being story repetition. So, story repetition is kind of the same things we hear about in school or whatever, but it's when you are repeating the same concept or thing constantly, but rewording it in a different way. So you'll have a story where it's talking about, let's say it's talking about someone being breathless, but then they'll find every word in the dictionary to use the word breathless in, and it lasts 4 to 5 paragraphs. This can get kind of annoying, and I feel like people do this in order to lengthen their stories, which I feel like is kind of a cheesy way of doing it, and it can make the story become extremely stale really quickly. And the times I see this the most often is typically a well written story, but paragraphs are just constantly repeating with the same information, just with different or bigger words. The next thing within this bracket would be community repetition. Community repetition to me is when every story in the community ends up the same way and there's no predictability. It almost seems like every single person is writing the same thing but at different times. Or they get an idea from somebody else and just write it slightly different. This isn't entirely annoying, it's just something that I do see quite often in the community. I would much prefer to read a more original and interesting story that I haven't heard before without having to be able to predict the rest of the story. And I'm not talking about like, oh, and they end up in a happy ending or there's a major character death. I don't mean anything like that, because obviously most of the community wants one of those two things for the most part. But I just mean like certain instances in the story. Another pet peeve of mine that I'm going to talk about is that there is no character development. So, no character development can also make a story very stale and boring. And it's not usually just one character that doesn't develop, but it's most of the characters that don't develop. So, like, you'll have a character go through like all of this nonsense, but they actually didn't learn anything from what happened. And then usually they end up making the same mistake 20 or 30 times. And that gets kind of, again, stale and boring. And this also happens with the characters that are a part of the fandom. Because the character has already been created, I feel like writers feel like they can't add to the character, when in all actuality, you entirely can, and you can make this character do and say things and act a certain way because it's a free fan fiction. But having these characters be the exact same from the game, movie, TV show, or whatever kind of ruins the character because even in those you see character development, except maybe in games depending. And then you write a story and they're just the exact same character. Another one of my pet peeves are pointless characters. These are typically characters that are added into the story but don't do anything. Whether it's because it's a character insert or a writer insert, or because they felt like they needed to have more characters to make the story better, I'd much rather have a crappy written character that has a point rather than a pointless character who doesn't add anything to the plot. I've seen this happen in quite a few Wattpad stories, but I don't see this too much on like AO3 or anything else. The next pet peeve I'm going to talk about is when languages are not being translated. So let's say a character has a native tongue but also speak in English. This can happen with a bunch of different characters, depends on who you pick. And every once in a while, a writer will write dialogue of a character in their native tongue, but they won't have the translation, or they'll have the translation either in the notes or at the bottom of the story. I would much rather have the translation in parentheses either next or right under where the language is so that it doesn't break my immersion from the story. And if it's not in the fan fiction at all, it really breaks the immersion when you're having to go to Google Translate in order to figure out what the character said because I don't know if it's valuable information until I translate it. Having some kind of indicator of what that person is saying in another language would be nice. And obviously, if you're writing this for like your friends or something and they understand the language, you might not entirely think that, but it would be helpful for people who do not know the language to understand what the character is saying. And this has nothing to do with stories that are written in different languages. That's not what I'm talking about at all. This is when the entire story is pretty much written in English, but there is a language dialogue with someone's character playing or speaking a different language. So this one I might get a little bit heated about, but another pet peeve is having unfinished stories on the platform, but the author not specifically saying that it is unfinished. This can be really annoying, and you can look at like when it was last updated, and that can kind of tell you if someone is still working on the story. But every once in a while, some creators just have slow updates because they have to deal with other things in life. And you might skip over a story thinking that it's unfinished, but actually, someone just has slower updates. And slow updates is fine if you have other stuff to do. I'm not really angry or anything with you. But when you realize that you're never going to finish the story, it's very helpful to tell your readers if you're going to continue the story. And it's preferred if it's said at the very beginning of the story, or as an author's note, or in the summary, or even in the title if you edit the title. It would be nice to see that it has not been worked on and that it might not be worked on. And then you're not reading an entire story and then it just ends abruptly and you're waiting for a year and then you're like, well, I guess they're not updating. And this also doesn't go to people who have like accidents or other things going on in their lives, like I said earlier. This is specifically to people who continue to post on the platform, but they're writing other stories instead of writing the story they're already started on. Another pet peeve of mine is when there is constant tension in the story. This is very circumstantial. If the story only has 15 to like 20 chapters, it's not as bad. But when you have a story that's 70 chapters long and then it's just a constant back and forth of like tension between the two characters, it gets annoying when like nothing happens between the characters. This kind of goes back with story repetition, and it's more like they're not doing anything to increase the relationship or the event or whatever that's trying to happen, but they're also not doing that, if that makes any sense. And like the entire time you're just thinking, when will these two like fuck or get it on, or when will this fucking event happen? We all know it's gonna happen. Why can't we get to the event already? It makes, again, drawing it out makes it very slow. And at some point, sometimes I have to just stop in the middle of the story and be like, I can't. And I'll start skipping over chapters just so I can get to the end. This one kind of goes back to the last point, but when the characters have extremely terrible communication. And this is a particular communication where others don't have issues with. And this also isn't when the characters are like emotional or anything, but again, it just kind of it draws tension between the two characters when in the first place they never needed tension if they would have just said something. And like they don't have to say like exactly what's upsetting them or making them happy or whatever the case may be. But like explaining that like I'm not ready to talk about it would be much better than them not communicating at all. This can also make the characters become stale and boring because it again puts them at a standstill and it doesn't deepen the plot for them to hide certain information. Even if us, the reader, know what it is, we already know what it is. I don't need 20 chapters to tell me that they can't communicate. And this is going to be my final pet peeve, but it's improper grammar, but to a certain extent. Now, if it's somebody whose native tongue or first language is not English or whatever the language it's in, this isn't for them. I completely understand if they have a hard time adjusting to a second language. This is more for the people who are past high school or in high school or at a certain extent where they're writing stories, but they still use the wrong grammar in a story. And something I really want to touch on in this section is specifically when people do not use the word nod or shake of the head. I've seen a lot in stories when a character will ask another character a question, and then the character will either shake their head yes or nod their head no, which doesn't make sense. A shake of the head is when they are shaking their head back and forth, explaining no, while a nod of the head is nodding your head up and down to say yes. Again, I don't really see this event happening too often, but it does happen eventually or every once in a while. That was really the main thing when it comes to improper grammar. If somebody misspells something every once in a while, it doesn't really bother me. People misspell things all the time. I misspell things all the time. And I can completely understand if, like, at the time you didn't notice it and then you change it later or you just leave it because you're lazy. I can completely understand that. But when the actions that are said are not working with each other, it can kind of be annoying to read because you're like, oh, she shook her head, that means no. And then all of a sudden you're like, she shook her head yes. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess she said yes. That's confusing. Anyway, those were my main fanfiction pet peeves. Again, if you write fanfiction or if you read fanfiction, these are not things that tell you that you're a bad writer. These are just my own pet peeves in the fandom that every once in a while annoy me. And half the time when I do go through the fandom and I'm looking at all of these things or I'm reading these fan fictions, I'll still continue to read them for the most part, even with all of these there. And in the past, when I've written my own fan fiction, I've also done some of these things in the past, and eventually I ended up stop doing them, but every once in a while I still end up doing one of these things, but I try very hard to not do them anymore. If you have any of these pet peeves, please let me know in the comment section. I'm genuinely curious. And tell me what kind of pet peeves you had for fan fiction or just reading in general. That's going to be it for this video. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're feeling up to it. Any support is appreciated, and I will see you in the next one.